I woke up with a headache, consequence of my preference for brandy being usurped by the provisions available to the partygoers. Champagne leaves you dry-mouthed and irritable the next morning, in my experience. The silken bedclothes were a comfort. 3 days on spring cots left my back a bit sore in places. I gave a yawn and wrapped my arms around her. That damned cherry smell wafted past her pillow and into my nostrils, carried on those black locks that moved with the wind emanating from the open window. God in heaven, what have I done? Sneaking away from a sleeping lover is the worst part of unplanned dalliances. You budge bit by bit until you can make it clear of the sheets while she sleeps, and endeavor to make the least noise possible, lest she catch you in the act. For most men, this is a complex task. For a man with my difficulties, this is almost impossible. My clumsy attempts to grasp my left arm with my right began the debacle. I pivoted towards the edge of the bed when I felt a hand run down my back. Her voice grasped my psyche once again.
Stay, love friend.
It would be indelicate to brush her off, would it? What does she know of polite decorum? Her ability to evolve to the needs of the situation last night gives me pause at the thought that she knows far more than she lets on. Here would be the photographer's prize. The crown prince of the German Empire shares a bed with a reptile-riding primitive. I can smell the newsprint ink already. That would have been worth disposing of a photographer over, not what happened last night. Staring at the cherry wardrobe at the left of the bed, I finally summoned a response. I must dress and leave. You wait here and leave after. No one must see you.
Stay and give me life again.
If I turned, I would have. Her tantalizing figure brought me to my basest desires. I will not have it happen again. I declined to gaze at her and strode towards the water closet. The warm water was liberating and provided an opportunity to review the events thus far. My murder must have been properly obscured, as there were no flushing bobbies breaking down the door to my chamber. The party went as well as expected. My succumbing to Sintra's feminine wiles would be able to remain a secret. Nothing catastrophic has happened, nothing that cannot be lied about and swept under the rug. There's the soap. I emerged from the shower with a reassured confidence that all would be well. She must have gone while I bathed. The silhouette of her on the surface of the mattress gave a mournful feeling. I fear this may be my biggest mistake. I could march Fifth Corps into the sea and receive a better reception at court than if my drunken foolishness became known. I would need to find a way to dispose of this terrible little secret. But first, as with all days, one must take breakfast. And I was pleasantly surprised. One hears jokes of the ability of the English to cook with anything more than salt and flour, but the service was thoroughly adequate. The parlor had been opened for the purpose, and thankfully, I wasn't the last one to take my seat. The honor was bestowed on Tirpitz, who seemed to be rebounding from the champagne worse than I had. I could see him raise the issue of drawing the curtains and taking breakfast by candlelight. Such was his sensitivity to the morning shine. The servant declined and made some appropriate excuse that his master would find it difficult to locate his plate on the table. Our hosts, generous as they are, demanded that their staff begin to retrieve the servingware while we took in a breakfast carafe. Tea is their preferred beverage, but I am given to assume that Colonel Grey had been informed about our love of coffee. Sugar cubes on little plaited doilies, even a little sterling silver clamp to deposit them into our cups. I was discussing this discrepancy in beverage preferences when Sintra took her seat next to me. I didn't turn. I wanted to, but I didn't. I felt her calf wrap around mine under the table, and it took all the discipline in the world not to shout at her. Thankfully, our host finally opened his mouth and made an inquiry.
How did His Highness enjoy our soiree?
Very much, Colonel. It is always a pleasure to take in good company.
I received a report this morning that some of your men have been engaging in a bit of debauchery in Jackstown.
If you will be so kind as to forward those reports to my staff, I am happy to dispense appropriate punishment.
Punishment? Nonsense. Your men have been on the march for half a week. We take no umbrage at their activities, though I would advise you that the opium dens and other depravities available there have claimed more than their fair share of our own men. I would hate for your Highness's cohort to suffer the same fate.
I appreciate the forward thought, Colonel. Breakfast is served, thank God. Egg on toast, smoked haddock, salted tomatoes, clotted cream and crumpets. Again, My fears regarding the knowledge of our hosts rose, as my plate had already been neatly divided into manageable portions. That didn't concern me as much as other things. Now would come a new challenge. I had recalled Cintra's fingers finessing the pork from our dinner in the field some nights before. Now, despite all else, my great fear was embarrassment. A new dance began. I finally shifted my gaze towards her, and I could see the trepidation on her face as the clinking of flatware on plates began. I raised up the proper fork and again locked eyes with her. She mirrored me, and did so throughout the course of the meal. Thankfully, our host consumed his plate slow enough to allow for a new student to table manners enough time to learn. No embarrassment, other than a loud slurp from her when taking her tea. As we wrapped up our meal, that dreadful question that I had been rolling around in my mind finally came from the mouth of our honorable host's wife. Thankfully, the colonel didn't seem too fussed with the matter.
You know, I booked that photographer for yesterday evening, and he never showed.
Which one was that, darling?
The Parisian, Alemant, I think, publishes for La Croix.
Shall I pay a call to them for a refund?
I shouldn't think so. Perhaps he was here and I didn't notice.
If we find our pictures in the broadsheets, we will have our answer, darling.
No, you won't. I finished my coffee and excused myself to take a cigarette in the garden. Tirpitz and Moltke wanted to begin their barrage of questions regarding our departure timetable, but I politely asked them to sort it out between them and leave me some measure of solitude before we rejoined the column. Again, the garden was as lovely in the daylight as it was in the evening. Dona, with her horticultural fixation, would have a field day out here, amongst all the plants. Some were more familiar than others. Peonies and roses seemed to run the length of the curtilage, those topiaries sculpted into various shapes. Hedgerows that had seen one murder too many. One even appeared as a great squat bulb emerging from the earth, with a wrought iron fence surrounding it. I struck the match against my boot heel. Neat trick picked up at the academy. A gloved hand found its way to my shoulder. There she is again. I lacked an appropriate opera-length holder for her, but offered her a puff nonetheless. Disturbingly, she took it in stride, not a cough. Dona always hated the things. Her friends at court would take them on occasion, and such behavior was often the subject of bedside discussion. Cintra handed it back to me, and I turned away from the windows of the little chateau, lest prying eyes discern my speech from the movements of my lips. This needs to be kept secret. You cannot tell anyone.
Red and blue women smoke. It is not a problem.
No, Cintra. Last night, us.
Oh, Prince should be proud. Conqueror.
No, Prince should be ashamed. Adulterer.
Adulterer?
Never mind. Last night was a mistake. This seemed to hurt her. I could see the reddening in her eyes that so often prefaced tears.
Prince does not want me?
God, I do. I want your thoughts and your help. I cannot have your body.
Is my body not a help?
I'm blushing. So was she. I took hold of her hand and gazed into those blue eyes. You cannot tell anyone. Promise me. Tell me you understand.
Yes, Prince.
Good enough. The colonel's staff had generously assisted in collecting our luggage and loading them into our Daimlers. I exchanged farewells with him before we left, and he insisted that we would be welcome back at any time. It was now nearly 10 in the morning, and it became clear that we should set off towards our final destination. Our return down the boulevards of New Kirkwall was unceremonious. Just as in London, the streets had filled with merchants peddling their wares, tavern brawls breaking out into the cobbled avenues, and the ashy scent of fires lit in brick chimneys began to stick to our uniforms. Our departure from the southern gate was more of a shambles than our leaving from Paris several days earlier. It had been called out that the men were to assemble in column to begin the last leg of our journey. One of the 4th Company commanders handed me a dossier regarding the reports of debauchery that Colonel Grey had described at breakfast. 2 men under discipline for intoxication, 4 for being caught by their superiors in the opium den, and 24 had to be roused from their comfortable position in the Jackstown brothels. I insisted that they would be subject to duty owing rather than a flogging, as we didn't have the time to proceed with the more potent punishment. Eventually, just several minutes prior to noon, we set off once again. The vegetation proved just as thick as before. I put forward our askari with their machetes to clear the roadway for the column. Useful fellows, and loyal to a fault. Their command of our language is tenuous on occasion, but their commanding officers know enough of their native tongues to make communication fairly easy. As we ventured further from New Kirkwall, we began to lose the road. I could see Moltke's frustration with not being allowed to lead the column in person. He and his mount strode right beside our motor carriage. A conversation inevitably developed. He spoke first.
Your Majesty, with all hope this vegetation will quit the field and we will be able to move forward at our planned pace.
Hopefully, Major General. Our destination will not be in our grasp until tomorrow morning, at this rate. We reproduced the maps while the auxiliaries continued to clear the vegetation. Another several hours would lead us to the western coast of this great inland sea and towards the planned locale for the settlement. I had occasion to speak with some of the engineers regarding the state of our provisions, and all insisted that we would be able to sustain ourselves for several months before needing to receive resupply. Tirpitz had been constantly scribbling in the stupid little notebook he had carried around since our supernatural experience in Kiel. What he was writing, God only knows. Eventually, the vegetation began to give way, and we returned to the path without incident. Sintra and I, seated in the Daimler, shoved along at a steady pace on the white sandy beach that bordered the left of the column. As I was driving, she took my binoculars and kept an eye on the skies. Another strange string of those flying fish rose from the surf in the far distance, like a typhoon of silvered scales shining in the fading light. I stopped the Daimler and took in the scenery. Several kilometers forward of us, several tributaries of this great sea flowed into a series of soft, rolling hills. While the vegetation was not nearly as dense as it had been before, the date palms and desert scrub dotted the landscape. Occasion flocks of gulls and various other birds took flight over the column, and the warm lapping of the surf against the shore gave the whole scene an idyllic tone. Looked like a postcard from the Levant. Perhaps this would be the promised land, a land with a promise for greatness. We extricated ourselves from the Daimler and had a luncheon. Some of our escort provided the folding chairs and a camp stool on which we took our sustenance. There, seated on the beach as the column continued to roll onwards, Sintra, Moltke, Tirpitz and I took in a sound meal of smoked haddock and asparagus. Tirpitz revealed some of his hidden stores and popped the cork on another bottle of champagne. After the previous nights, the label Bollinger or Clicquot gave my breakfast a rise in my throat and a throbbing in my forehead. I declined my share of it and opened the discussion. Commander, are you entirely sure that the waters of this world are safe for traverse?
Safe as houses, Your Majesty. Our scientific contingent's efforts on identifying the various wildlife reveals little serious danger.
What is it that you consider a serious danger?
Anything larger than our craft itself, some manner of aquatic reptiles that belong to the antediluvian world.
You are confident that our weaponry will dissuade them from intercepting our supplies?
As I said weeks ago, Your Majesty, even if only 8 of 10 submersibles make it to our new settlement, we will be more than amply provisioned.
I pondered his optimism and turned to Sintra, pointing towards the waters. Dangerous? She gave a shrinking look of fear and gave a response in the affirmative. Are they like your people's mounts, the dangers?
No. Larger, more teeth, more hidden.
Large?
Very large, Prince.
Moltke piped up.
Whatever lies therein, it cannot be shell-proof. If it is made of flesh and blood, canister will reduce it to its constituent components.
If you can hit it, absolutely.
I have full confidence that we can.
I wish I shared it, Major General.
Shared what, Your Majesty?
Your confidence. A shot rang out from the column. As there were no screams, I assumed that there had been some kind of marksmanship contest between officers during our pause. Nothing serious, surely. Another rang out and I dismissed it as the competitor's response. Again, no screams. As with most meals taken on our march so far, this one would be interrupted. I didn't hear the screams, but a shocked-looking lieutenant made his way to our little picnic, his field cap held low in his hands.
Your Majesty, I bring news of a casualty in the ranks.
I looked skyward, expecting the deluge of spears and rocks to commence. Nothing but the birds and the fish. Moltke and Tirpitz rose from their seats and unholstered their arms. Shall we call to arms?
The situation seems to be under control, but I humbly request that you see the man himself.
What exactly happened?
As I say, Your Majesty, this is something you best see for yourself. I shouldn't wish to inspire panic in the men.
But what about inspiring panic in your commanders? Very well, Lieutenant. Show me what it is that you seem so willing to share with us. I followed him off of the beach and towards the tree line abutting the roadway. I wish that I hadn't. I really wish that I hadn't. The men in the column had taken up cover on an escarpment between the roadway and the trees. Having heard no screams, I assumed that all was well, and that the shots I had heard before were some kind of competitive gunplay or a negligent discharge. Discipline would be necessary for either case, but if we were to be attacked, that would have to wait for the time being. The lieutenant led me into the underbrush and towards what his men had discovered. Another private, Jaeger group, judging by the tools on his pack, must have been off relieving himself without an escort from his fellows. His helmet had been cracked open by some blunt force. Such as it was, our proud golden spike had been dislodged from the socket and fell onto the deciduous soil below. Mutilated, missing both eyes, and in their absence, bloody, empty sockets. His lips had been torn away, revealing that nightmarish rictus grin that must have set in not minutes before. His trousers have been undone to the second to lowest button. The smell of powder lingered, but his weapon was nowhere to be found. I studied the body alongside the company medicals, when another voice shouted out,
"He didn't miss, Lieutenant. We have an enemy here."
Strangely calm. The enemy must have predeceased our man. No shots or shouting. Our boy must have made a corpse of his assailants before he was subject to his grisly fate. Two of our Jaegers hauled out an ape. At least it appeared as an ape. A squat, hairy thing, smelled like a horse paddock. Mud filled the gaps between the hair and mottled skin. A clean shot bore through the left breast, terminating in an exit wound the size of a fist. One of the Jaegers heaved it out of the bushes and onto the ground before us. A simian face, eyes rolled back into the skull, exposing bloodshot whites.
"Another one, just here."
Should have put the man up for a marksmanship accolade had he lived. Another of these apes was produced before us, this time a clean shot through the eyes that brought him down. The alabaster bone fragments from the thing's skull littered the ground around it. The weapons they used, these primitive clubs with sharpened stone fragments embedded within, were found next to their corpses. It became obvious that there must have been more. It was doubtful that either of these animals could have committed that heinous mutilation with the injuries they sustained. I instructed the lieutenant to produce a cotton sheet to cover over our man's body while we searched the underbrush in an effort to locate the enemy. No man was to be told of the assault until such time as command deemed it necessary, and his body would be stored with the civilian supplies until an appropriate burial could take place. He nodded grimly and began his business. Searching the vegetation proved useless. If one could find tracks, they would so often lead into circles or upwards towards the trunks of the trees. I elected to return to the column and issued orders to the effect that no man would leave the sight distance of the column unless accompanied by 2 other men. I wouldn't let this god-forsaken place take more of us. An idea struck me and called for Sintra to come to me. She appeared shortly thereafter, and thankfully the lieutenant had covered our man such that her sensibilities would not be offended. Or would they? What are these? I gestured towards the enemy, their rough hides slowly darkening as day turned to evening.
Man apes, savage, ambusher.
Ambusher, like your people. She looked a fury at me.
No, no, no. These have no honor. These kill for fun.
Fun?
Savages, pillagers, scum.
I turned over the corpse and revealed the results of the private's well-aimed shots. She gave an enthusiastic smile, which put me off somewhat, and then she asked that terrible question.
They take trophies?
In the world above, such degeneracy can only be punished by execution. Amongst the savage tribes of Central Asia or Africa, it was not uncommon for the uncivilized to mutilate their foes after, or during the heat of combat, and we, good Christian soldiers, would demonstrate to them the error of their ways by cannonade and rifle fire, and all manner of remorseless pieces of metal at great velocity. It became clear that this world was no different. Yes, She looked downwards, clearly avoiding telling me some other terrible truth.
They eat them. Eat the whole man.
Where do they live?
Little camp. Little cave. Mud hut.
Can you find them?
Yes, Prince.
I made the medicals stay with our man, and had the Jaeger load the bodies of the enemy into wagons for study by our scientifically minded comrades. I had a mixed mind over sending Sintra to track the simians. I pondered the decision at length before giving her leave to go. If she returned, we could exact revenge for our fallen brother. If she didn't return, it was one less thing, one less secret to continue concealing. I didn't want to let her go. I didn't want her hurt, or worse. I love her. Stop it! The double-time order to pack it in and begin a night march was met with complaints from the men, but they acquiesced after a promise of a delayed rise tomorrow morning. I wouldn't let them get themselves killed here, in this dark place. Sintra was given some measure of rations and equipment for her trek by the quartermasters general, and disappeared into the darkness of the foliage. Our march continued. It was several hours before we found ourselves at the confluence that we had sighted from the beach, nearly there, by our estimations, to our eventual destination. Just up the ridge and inland, we staked out the perimeter of the camp, and the sentries maintained vigil. Just as the prior nights, the tents were erected, fires set alight, and supply wagons rolled out for the dinner distribution. I couldn't find my appetite. Several hours passed before I recognized that I now owed a new duty to 5th Corps. The soil up towards the ridge proved sufficient for the burial of our fallen man. I grabbed the 4th Company chaplain and some of the medicals to assist us. The words were said, and the shovels dug a resting place for the unfortunate fellow. The eulogy became frustrated when the padre couldn't recall the man's name, so we opted to retrieve his identification tags from his effects. Read by lantern light. Arthur Wendelson, 31st Jaeger Group, fallen in combat with the enemy. May God commend his soul to heaven. May he so commend all of us. I screamed. I wasn't ashamed of it. Someone had grabbed me by the shoulder in the middle of the night. Had it been one of these apes, that would have been the end. But it wasn't. We turned, and the lantern light flicked over Sintra's form.
Found them.
Good. I followed her further up the ridge. It did not take her long to find them. Their fires gave them away, a kilometer away by my reckoning. Just as she described, several dozen mud huts arranged in a circle. Thatched roofs and simple tools littered their unkempt and uncivilized settlement, large enough to warrant a slow clearing by infantrymen. No, this would require a demonstration of force. Dozens of them danced around the fire in a circle. Spiked clubs and improvised spears raised and lowered with their rhythmic chants and guttural utterances. Thank you, Sintra. We will get revenge.
As Prince wishes.
And it would be cold and sweet. The plan was formulated easily. Our return trip down from the ridge and towards camp made it easy to iron out all the little details. Our infantry companies would be able to remain in camp and enjoy a late rise, and we would give call upon Diesel's walking engines and the artillerymen to take position on the ridge near their settlement. As dawn, or whatever passes for it down here, rose, they would lay a destructive fire down on the apes. Savages, man or beast, will always understand a show of force. I couldn't sleep through the evening, such was the excitement of the planned reprisal. I bid Falkenhayn boil me coffee as I gave instruction to the relevant commanders. It became clear that the artillery officers would have difficulties managing their men without proper motivation. It was not my desire to reveal the motivation behind our attack until the men were more secure in their surroundings. Revealing that one of their compatriots had been subject of such a vicious attack would set rumors abound in the camp. I managed to get them to comply with the orders with a distribution of schnapps from the civilian stores. Nothing terribly intoxicating. It wouldn't harm, I thought, for a pick-me-up, and they would be firing on a stationary target. How hard could it be to hit? Heinrich had reappeared at this point. One of our sentries desired to regale me with a story about how he had accompanied the men into the Jackstown taverns from the previous evening, and attempted to engage in their drinking games. The tavern-goers seemed perturbed by his presence, but the greater distraction seemed to be our lads spending their limited pay on English ale. Heinrich put down nearly 7 liters of the brown, warm inebriants before beginning to sway on his amphibian appendages. After that, He disappeared towards the canals of the city and was not seen again until the order had come down this morning to form up for march. Perhaps he paid a visit to family beneath the waves. I gave him a pat on the head and bid him towards the mass of artillerymen, who took to rubbing on his helmet for good luck. Dawn eventually rose, and the time came for action. The gun wagons rolled up towards the ridge, and the spotters began to range in the guns towards the targets. Diesel himself decided to arrange the participation of the walking engines and carefully guided them upwards towards the crest of the hill, just to the right of the artillerymen. I could hear the infantry and command staff begin to complain about the obscene noise at this early hour, but this complaint would be sloughed off, as so many had been before. Sintra and I decided to observe the event personally. I wasn't sure if Moltke or Tirpitz had been in attendance. Moltke was more likely to appear than Tirpitz, as this was his forte, and Tirpitz would have been tucked in tight with the bottle of champagne from lunch. Nevertheless, I didn't seek them out. They deserve some shut-eye just like the rest of the men. Some carts with sandbag ballasts had been brought up to the new firing position and were laid end to end in front of the guns. About 10 minutes in, the artillery commander tapped me on the shoulder as I leaned over the parapet, glancing through my glass. He insisted that all crews were ready for the order. I felt it necessary to take one last glance at our quarry before the hunt. In my sights, the apes began to rise. Scuttling about their dirty hovels, some began to retrieve their tools from their rituals from the prior evening, and some, presumably females, retrieved their young and carried them about on their back. No quarter, no mercy, not anymore. I wanted to watch this little stain on our new promised land be lifted by shellfire. I gave the order to fire without lifting my glass from my eye. Sintra, standing next to me, grabbed onto me like a drowning man to driftwood and buried her face into my shoulder, but I did not shift my gaze. They are loud things, these Krupp guns, less of the crack of a rifle and more of a rolling thunder across the walls and landscape of this world. I caught sight of some of the apes looking into our direction and giving a curious screech before the first shell found its mark. A great plume of dust and stone erupted from the wall of one of the mud huts, engulfing one of their number and hurling great chunks of wattle into the air. More shells then followed. A grisly reminder of their effectiveness found me when a pair of furry arms flew into the air, clear over one of their huts. Reload. I remained transfixed. Some of them began running to and fro between the buildings that were quickly wiped from the earth. One of the thatched roofs had caught fire and collapsed in a cacophony of animalistic shrieks. A grotesque red smear was the only indication where one of the apes had been struck by our shells. Blood and viscera running up the side of a sagging wall all the way up to the joist. Reload. There wasn't much left to see in the cloud of dust that enveloped the area. I could still hear some screams, but most had gone quiet by this point. Within minutes, the dust had dissipated and revealed the destruction. Had there ever been a primitive settlement there, one would not have known afterwards. Craters and collapsed piles of dried mud and thatch were all that remained. Several of the stones around their campfires lodged themselves in the great sandstone cliff that overlooked their encampment. Some bodily remains, none whole, rolled around on the ground like a child's discarded playthings. Ceasefire. The walking engines began to descend the crest of the hill towards the encampment. I caught sight of one of the enemy that remained, several of which came forward to attack our position, but were caught short. Several more blasts sounded out, reducing their resistance to gory stamps in the landscape. Further on, 2 or 3 of them began hurling spears at the machines, whose stone tips shattered against the steel chassis. One of the engines trod over the apes as they began to dissolve into the field further on. I couldn't hear that heinous wet squelch that it surely made, but I could imagine it in my mind. Our machines scuttled around the ruins of their little village for several minutes, before one of their crew popped the top hatch and raised the appropriate signal flag. Area secure, primitives destroyed. Sintra said something to me, but it was difficult to hear over the ringing in my ears. I turned to her and could see the tears starting to form. I took her in my arms and bade the artillery commander clean his bores before packing up the position. I walked with her, back down towards the camp. The ringing had begun to dissipate as the shouted orders from the gun crews became discernible. Sintra turned towards me, and I asked her to repeat what she had said. The tears came in earnest now.
Why? Why like this?
They are the enemy. In war, you kill your enemies.
Not war, not that.
What is that, if not war?
Murder!
She continued her sobbing.
War is honor. War is the fight.
This is our war, our way. She turned those teary eyes towards me.
When my people come, give them the fight, not the murder.
I grabbed her arm and gripped tighter than etiquette would dictate. If they come for a war, we will give them a war. Our war. The men in camp were thoroughly roused from sleep by the barrage. Thankfully, the officers on hand dissuaded them from the impression that the camp was under attack. I took 2 of the pioneer sections and had them move towards the remains of the 8-man village to remove anything of value and demolish any standing structures. The great work must now begin. In these rolling hills, our mission would be accomplished. Finally, after a week of wandering this new world, our civilians took the fore. Engineers and representatives of various interests, just as sections would form a company, grouped themselves up and began their tasks. Surveyors first, taking in the measure of the land and staking perimeters for construction. Management, deep in canvas tents, retrieved blueprints for structures and transportation systems and all manner of logistics. Even the workmen, taking up picks and shovels, received instruction on the best places to begin breaking ground and headed off into the hills to start a full day of work. The burden of this last week passed from the epauletted officer to the suit and tie-clad businessman. It was something of a relief. I took in my 4th cup of coffee, poring over some of the notes made by our scientific adjutants regarding the ape men, Homo sapiens floresiensis, limited in capacity for complex activities, fire and stone tools the extent of their technological development, presumed forebear of modern man, per Darwin's estimations. Sintra sat on my cot as I pored over the notes. The sobbing had stopped, but the sniffles continued as I read. I paid it no mind. I wanted to console her, but proper conduct towards a prisoner is neutrality, not sentimentality. She's your prisoner, or your lover. Stop it. I cogitated over her words from moments ago. Our way of war is civilized. Man need not choke the life from another man in mortal combat for one side to gain victory. No spears thrust into the guts of men, or daggers cutting throats to leave only the gurgling, choking victim to drown in his own blood. No Homeric tradition governs our method. Our method is the scalpel. Our method is the steam hammer. Our method is civilized. Is it? Of course it is. If God had meant for man to kill with sword and spear, he would not have given him scientific reasoning. That scientific reasoning gave us the cannon and the rifle and the machines that shielded the sensitive psyche of man from the act of killing. The sniffling continued. I produced my handkerchief from my breast pockets and handed it to her. She took it, and rather than blowing her nose properly, wrapped it around her finger and began digging through her nostrils. She's still a primitive. She's still subhuman. But you still love her nonetheless. Stop it. I needed to get away from the tent. Walking out towards the ridge, I spied the civilian contractors beginning their work in earnest, a more permanent work than the efforts by our soldiers when making camp in the evening, tracing pathways for streets, marking out footprints for concrete foundations, making our mark in this world above the stains that the locals left behind. I took lunch with Moltke after my sojourn. Tirpitz was busy giving instruction to the contractors regarding the necessary depth of a rudimentary port and dock. He seemed perturbed that he was not included in this morning's show of force.
I take it His Majesty is satisfied with the performance of our artillery.
I am. They will be tremendously advantageous down here, especially against the primitives.
It was a pity I missed it. I was too busy organizing your defense.
There was snark in his tone with which I had reached my limit. If something is on your mind, Major General, I would have you speak it aloud.
Certainly. Supreme command belongs to you, Your Majesty, but I would appreciate being informed about the use of so many military assets, the nominal command over which is still my right.
Understandable. Going over another's head was such a bother in surface life. Complaint received and dismissed. You had no notion of what needed to be done because you squirreled yourself away in your tent with your charts and your diagrams. You made no effort to gain a grasp of the situation and the action that it demanded.
And the grasp of your situation, my prince, was held tight over the curvaceousness of that primitive you've taken a liking to?
I hit him. I shouldn't have, but I did. My good hand still had some heft behind it, and I could hear the clap of the back of my knuckles against the flesh of Moltke's cheek. He didn't respond to the provocation. Some of the men in the command caserne left their lunch where it sat on the tables and began to walk out of the tent. Moltke rose and took his plate to his own accommodation. I sat and furiously retrieved my cigarette case, that cool, relieving flame that remedied any injury of the soul or body. I left my plate largely uneaten and returned to my tent. My command to the sentry was to bring an open bottle of brandy and leave me with it. The commotion of the supply wagons unloading and the men carousing gave a good shield to my impropriety with Moltke. I would have to apologize eventually. Not quite yet, though. An adjutant found me, brandy in his hand. Finally, a reprieve. The snifter absolved my mind of all burdens. I should have invited Tirpitz, but he seemed to disappear into the camp like a phantom, only to be discovered when food or drink was freely available. I did miss carousing with him, but I remained concerned with his behaviors. Unruliness was not outside his wheelhouse, but he is an officer of the Imperial Navy and should comport himself with more dignity. The civilians laid out lanterns around their work sites to continue their labors through the evening. The clicking of pickaxes against the stones and soil created a rhythm that entranced the rest of the camp. Soon enough, this camp would turn into a fortress, and a fortress into a city. Time would roll by, and its growth would be the only thing standing as a monument to the sacrifices we had made to get to this place. I summoned Falkenhayn to take dictation for me, a letter to the palace and the family, recounting the events of the last week. It seems appropriate. As I divulged my perception of events, Heinrich sat himself next to the fire and stared those black eyes directly into the flame, the eerie reflection of the fiery tendrils dancing in his oversized pupils. He seems almost normal now. What wonders may we yet discover in this strange new world? What horrifying denizens would visit themselves upon us? The warmth of the brandy began to take hold. I dismissed Falkenhayn to the post wagon before I started slurring my words. Sintra had taken to her cot and continued her stares in my direction. I reached for my cigarette case and failed to find it. Sintra succeeded, however, and placed one in the corner of my mouth while I struck the match. The sentry had enough intelligence to close the flap before I took her in my arms. She seated herself in my lap, and I felt the weariness begin to take me. That soft, ripe cherry smell that had enraptured me would take me again. No, you've made your mistake. You won't make it twice. She ran her fingers through my cropped hair, and I considered it. I considered just as I considered, and acted on it after that soiree back in New Kirkwall. I will admit to considering it again. As I considered it, the world slowly drifted into darkness. My eyes shut, but restful sleep would not find me. The nightmare that found me that night was the worst of them all. I was sat on a beach, white sands beneath my naked form beside a bubbling shadow. My eyes strained to discern the form, and my attempts to look upon it brought great pain to my eyes. The brightness of the light before me brought my attention forward. A clicking of boots' spurs against the pebbles in the sand echoed in the emptiness, as whatever it was moved behind me. A cold pair of hands rested themselves on my shoulders, looking from the corner of my eye, the grey flesh of a corpse, with yellowed fingernails digging into my flesh, just enough to cause pain, but not enough to draw blood. Enough of this! Enough of the fear and the doubt and the delusion. I summoned up my courage and gave a confrontation. What apparition now troubles my sleep? A voice, a man, like the cracking of a glacier, entered my ears. I am the shadow beneath the earth. I beat your great-grandfather at Jena and Auerstedt. I admired your ancestor, the old Fritz. You are not him. You are not enough to stop what yet comes. What will you do when the darkness comes to claim its due? When it finally takes hold, who will be with you? I woke up with a sweating start. Sintra stood in the corner, looking concerned. Despite the disagreement we had over the nature of man's wars, my position as her captor, and the irreconcilable differences between us and our peoples, she still stood by me. As she brought a moist cloth to my forehead, I could only consider my response to the assailant of my dreams. God. God is with me. God is with us. and we are with him. To those that now read this, understand that this new world beneath is not what it seems. It takes you in with the fascination of its new wonders, and it keeps you here by the dangers that prevail around every rock and bush. It presents you with dilemmas that no man can answer with full faith. It drives you to the precipice of insanity and tantalizes you with the things that only existed in the imagination. Only a week down here, and I find it difficult to reminisce about life above. I grasp at memories in my mind, and they dissipate as a beam of sunlight through a drawn curtain. He was right, Herr Diesel, in what he said to me in that now distant cafe in Berlin. The trouble isn't getting down here, to this new world beneath our own. The trouble is letting go.